8 years old, I used to ride my blue Schwinn bicycle up to my dad's law office in small-town Iowa on my way to the public library, my bicycle baskets filled with books. Imagine the power of a public library to a little girl in a small town who doesn't have any books of her own. So I'd stop by my dad's law office and say hi, and there in the waiting room sometimes sat Mrs. Van Allen. And Mrs. Van Allen would always say to me, "So what are you reading these days?" And I was very shy when I was 8 years old, and the last thing I wanted to do was to give an on-the-spot book report in my dad's law office to Mrs. Van Allen. But I always did it because she served on the library board, and she was the mother of 4 illustrious sons, one of whom was one of this country's most famous space scientists. And it took me years before I realized that it took Mrs. Van Allen, it took my parents, my mom and dad, my teachers, everyone in my community in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, to turn me into the avid reader that I became. And in fact, I came back to my hometown to teach for 25 years, and then I became the First Lady of Iowa, and I traveled all over the state from town to town, asking people young and old, "So what are you reading these days?" And I realized that I had turned into Mrs. Van Allen. And I was probably just as old and scary to them as I thought she was when I was 8 years old. So imagine how I felt when I had the opportunity to come to USAID to serve as Senior Advisor for International Education, when I learned that one of our goals is to teach millions of children to read around the world. So come with me to Malawi, one of the 50 countries where USAID education is working to end extreme poverty. In Malawi, it's the routine, the custom of the local mothers groups to sing visitors into the village. And on this particular day, the ambassador and I were coming to kick off a national reading program. And the mothers were singing in their local language, Chichewa. And their song said, "Invite the early grade reading activity into your homes and give it a seat." And in fact, these women invited us to their homes. They live in homes that are made of mud bricks with thatched roofs. Before the ceremony, they told us, "We so want our children to know that we care that they're learning to read. But we don't own one book. We don't own anything in our homes that has even one letter on it." So they decided to let their children write on the walls, and they invited a little boy forward to demonstrate. Now, I had an emotional moment because I remember coming home one day when our boys were little, and they had written all over the walls between their 2 bedrooms. And I had spent an angry hour with Mr. Clean removing all evidence of their handiwork. So what I saw in these women was that sense of community that Mrs. Van Allen embodies, that says, these are all our children. So in every classroom that I've visited for USAID, all over the world, what I found is empty bookcases, just like this one. No books in the classrooms. And if there is a school library, the books are often raggedy old books that people in other countries have discarded. They may be old chemistry textbooks or books that no child, no first grader could understand. And many of them are illustrated with pictures of little blonde girls riding tricycles down suburban streets. 250 million children in the world don't know how to read. 250 million children. Children need to learn to read so they can read to learn. This has implications for all of us, for our sense of security, for prosperity, and for the future of democratic societies. We all know that youth who know how to read are able to get a job and keep it, to support their families, to give back to their communities, and we all know the power of a good book to quality of life. So what we need is millions of books like this one, books in local languages with all different reading levels, in Chichewa and Hausa and Bimba and Urdu. We know, the research tells us that the best way to learn to read is in the language You were born hearing your mother sing to you, what we call mother tongue, or a language of the playground. So what we need is books so that children can practice. Most children in the world today don't even own one textbook, and those who do need to practice, and in order to practice, they have to have easy-to-read, low-cost books like this one, so they can practice and become fluent so they can understand. Because if you can read in your mother tongue, then you can read in any language. So take a moment to think about how each of you learned to read. It wasn't magic. Well, maybe a little magic, but mostly it was science, and it required a teacher, a trained teacher, someone who had a degree in education or a degree in reading. My colleague, who's a reading teacher and a reading specialist, Rebecca Rhodes, says that getting to that first word is the hardest part of learning to read. It involves hearing rich language and new words. It involves learning the names of the letters and the sounds they make, putting those sounds together to make new words, discovering sentences and reading faster and faster and faster until all of a sudden those shapes on the page begin to make sense and you can read. In this country, at the end of second grade, the lowest 10% of our children are reading about 30 words per minute. In English, children begin to become fluent about 40 words per minute. At the upper end, the top 10% of our second graders at the end of second grade are reading about 142 words per minute, with most of our children somewhere in between. In Malawi, 96% of the children at the end of second grade, and this is true in most of the countries where we work, they are not yet to the first word. Now, we've worked really hard and we're making progress. We've created an assessment, we've trained teachers, we've published textbooks in local language, we've worked with ministries. We are making progress in Malawi. But to really understand how much more work we need to do, you need to come with me back to Malawi to the classroom of Anita Banda. Anita Banda has been trained in the science of teaching reading. She understands the importance of a child-centered classroom, but she's trying to teach 200 children in this classroom. She doesn't have enough pencils, she doesn't have enough books, she doesn't have enough chairs. In fact, her children are practicing writing their letters in the air. And outside of that classroom, there's another one like this under a tree. And next door, the children are sitting on the floor with little nubbins of chalk, writing in the cement. Just imagine what Anita Banda could do if she had the tools that she needs, a couple of trained assistants, and hundreds of books like this one, because each child between first and third grade needs to be exposed to at least 100 books at various reading levels. In contrast, come back with me to Iowa, to Van Meter, Iowa, where Kate Lamore is teaching my grandson, Jake, who's 6 years old, to read. Kate's classroom is word-rich, and every week she downloads from her computer a simple paper book like this one, just copy paper stapled together so that her 21 children can take them home to read with their families. Now, I heard Jake trying to teach his 4-year-old sister to read not too long ago, and he was imitating Mrs. Lamore, and he said, "Ella, this is the strategy. First of all, you have to tap out the letters, then you have to chunk them together, then you have to visualize, and then you look at the pictures, and then you can read." This is how it could be in Malawi, too, if we let technology help. We now have an open source software that's going to allow the whole education community around the world to start producing those millions of books that we need. What we want to do is to create a digital library in the cloud. Not in the clouds, in the cloud. We want to populate the bookshelves of a digital library with those millions of books. And as Jake would say, here's the strategy. This is what we have to do. We have to write the books, first of all. We have to illustrate them. we have to translate them, we have to upload them, download them, we have to publish them, and get them into the hands of children. It's going to be a long time before the teachers that in these classrooms around the world have the computers or have the know-how to work with these kids. But we can help out, and this piece of software is a little bit of magic because this flash drive holds that open source software. And with this technology, we can all be heroes. It's a little bit of magic. Each one of us can change the life of a child because you can put this flash drive in any computer in the world, and with just a little bit of training, everyone can start writing these books. In fact, a couple months ago, we did our first workshop, the first of many we'll do around the world in Ethiopia, where local volunteers came together and started writing books for kids. And 2 weeks ago on the IU campus, we had a book hackathon, and we invited faculty and students, authors, illustrators. We invited the local community to join us. Even the mayor came on a Saturday morning to our book hackathon. We had a great time learning to use the technology and starting to write books for kids. So it's going to take a while for us to get this started, but we need your help. So if you're a college professor, imagine the power of this tool to let your students actually help us solve one of the biggest educational development problems we have right now. And if you're a student on this campus or some other campus, if you'd like to hold a book hackathon on your campus, please come see us. We'd be happy to help you get started. And if you belong to a community organization, to a faith-based organization, you own a private company, and you'd like to sponsor one of these book hackathons or one of the workshops we're holding, we would be delighted to have you partner with us. That would be great. And at the very least, sometime today or this weekend, if you would talk to somebody you know about what you learned here today, about how important it is for a child to learn to read so he or she can read to learn. And all of us can access the software right now and start producing books. So before I leave you, I'd like to take you back to Malawi and introduce you to a little girl named Martha. She's 7 years old. She's just learning to read. She's so shy that she can barely say her name above a whisper. She reminded me a lot of me when I was her age. And I asked the local reading specialist, Dr. Mike McCombie, who was with us, he grew up in this area, I said, how is Martha's life going to be different when she learns to read? And he said, look around you, you're surrounded by corn. I said, I know, I feel very comfortable here because these villages are very much like the ones that I grew up in. He said, she will be a farmer, but she's going to be a more prosperous farmer because she's going to read the extension information. She's going to grow better crops. And she'll be a healthier woman because she'll also read information about her health, and she'll probably space her children and have fewer of them. And he said, we also know, our research tells us that a woman who knows how to read, her children will live past 5 years old. And she will share that information with her community. And he said, for every year of education a girl has, her income goes up by 10%, and the gross national product of our country will go up as well. So I like to think that if we all together start building that digital library in the cloud and filling those bookshelves virtually, that someday Martha will be walking through her village on her way to a public library that maybe she helped create, stopping children along the way and saying, what are you reading these days? Thank you very much.